At some point, after the age of 60, something quietly changes inside many men. One day, they're always available. They answer every phone call. They show up whenever someone needs them. They keep the family together, solve other people's problems, and carry responsibilities without complaining. Then, almost without warning, they disappear. No arguments, no dramatic farewell, no long explanations, just silence. If you've ever wondered why some senior men suddenly cut everyone off, why they walk away from people they once loved, and why once they make that decision, they rarely look back, then stay with me. Because the psychology behind this behavior is far deeper than most people realize. For many older men, cutting people off isn't impulsive, bitter, or emotionally immature. It's often the final stage of a psychological journey that began decades earlier. By the time a man reaches his 60s, he has usually lived through disappointment, betrayal, family conflict, financial pressure, emotional neglect, and the painful realization that not every relationship is built on mutual respect. Unlike younger men who still believe every problem can be solved through more effort, many senior men eventually reach a different conclusion. They stop explaining, they stop negotiating, they stop trying to convince people to value them. Instead, they quietly step away. And once you understand why that happens, you'll never look at aging, relationships, or senior men the same way again. One of the strongest psychological reasons senior men cut everyone off after the age of 60 is emotional exhaustion. This isn't the kind of exhaustion that comes from working long hours or getting older. It's something much deeper. It's the exhaustion that builds after decades of carrying responsibilities that very few people ever noticed. For most of their lives, many men were expected to be the provider, the protector, the problem solver, and the one who stayed emotionally strong no matter what was happening inside them. Whenever someone needed help, they showed up. Whenever there was a crisis, they handled it. Whenever life became difficult, they were expected to carry the weight without complaint. Over time, that emotional weight becomes incredibly heavy. Many senior men begin to realize that while they spent years supporting everyone around them, very few people ever stopped to ask what they needed in return. Their own emotions were often pushed aside because someone else's problems always seem more important. After decades of putting themselves last, something inside them begins to change. By the time they reach their 60s, many men feel they have already given enough chances, enough explanations, enough compromises, and enough emotional energy for one lifetime. They no longer have the desire to keep proving themselves to people who only seem to appreciate them when they are giving something away. This is why cutting people off rarely feels like punishment to an older man. Psychologically, it feels like relief. He's no longer trying to manage everyone's expectations. He's finally protecting the one thing he has very little of left, his emotional energy. For many senior men, walking away isn't about hurting other people. It's about finally refusing to keep hurting themselves. Another powerful psychological reason senior men cut everyone off is that they eventually stop believing effort changes people. This is one of the biggest differences between younger and older men. Younger men often believe that if they communicate better, love harder, become more patient, or make one more sacrifice, the relationship will improve. They still have hope that people will eventually change if they just keep trying. Senior men see life very differently. By the time a man reaches his 60s, he has watched the same patterns repeat over and over again. He has seen promises made and broken. He has forgiven the same mistakes more than once. He has watched people apologize without changing their behavior. After enough experience, he begins recognizing patterns much faster than he recognizes words. This is why many older men appear to make sudden decisions. To everyone else, it looks as though they woke up one morning and decided to disappear. But psychologically, the decision was made long before they actually walked away. They had simply been observing quietly for months, sometimes even years. When a senior man notices constant disrespect, manipulation, selfishness, or emotional games repeating themselves, he rarely wastes energy arguing about it anymore. He no longer believes another conversation will suddenly transform someone's character. Instead of trying to fix the relationship, he simply removes himself from it. Many people mistake this for coldness, but it isn't. It's experience. Older men understand something younger men often learn the hard way. You cannot build a healthy relationship with someone who has no interest in changing. Once that realization becomes permanent, tolerance disappears. They stop negotiating, stop explaining, and quietly choose distance over disappointment. There is also a profound identity shift that takes place after the age of 60. Many senior men stop defining themselves by the roles they've carried for most of their lives. They're no longer trying to prove they're a good husband, a devoted father, a reliable employee, or the man everyone can depend on. Those roles may have shaped them for decades, but eventually something changes. They begin asking themselves a different question. What kind of life do I want to live for the years I have left? For many, the answer is surprisingly simple: peace. Not approval, not popularity, not being needed by everyone, just peace. And peace has standards. The moment an older man begins protecting his peace, his tolerance for unnecessary conflict drops dramatically. Constant criticism, emotional instability, entitlement, disrespect, manipulation, and never-ending drama no longer feel like problems to solve. They feel like burdens to remove. This is why so many people are shocked when a senior man suddenly distances himself. They assume he's become bitter or antisocial. What they fail to realize is that he has been quietly changing for years. He simply reached the point where protecting his peace matters more than protecting other people's feelings. Unlike younger men who often sacrifice their own well-being to keep relationships alive, older men begin valuing emotional stability above almost everything else. They understand that every argument, every unnecessary conflict, and every emotionally draining relationship comes at a cost. And at this stage of life, that cost feels far too expensive. So, instead of debating, defending, or trying to fix people, they quietly create distance. No drama, no announcements, just a decision that their remaining years will be spent protecting the peace they worked their entire lives to find. Another uncomfortable truth many senior men discover after the age of 60 is that they were often valued more for what they provided than for who they were. For years, they were the ones paying the bills, solving family problems, giving advice, fixing emergencies, and carrying responsibilities that everyone else relied on. As long as they kept providing, they felt appreciated. But the moment they began setting boundaries, saying no, or simply choosing themselves, some relationships started changing. This realization can be deeply painful. An older man begins noticing that certain people only call when they need money, a favor, advice, or someone to solve their latest crisis. Genuine conversations become rare. Appreciation disappears, but expectations remain exactly the same. At first, he ignores it. He tells himself he's imagining things. Then he starts paying closer attention, and the pattern becomes impossible to overlook. Psychologically, this changes the way he sees people. He begins asking himself difficult questions. Would this person still be in my life if I had nothing left to give? Do they value me, or do they simply value what I do for them? Once those questions begin, the relationship is never viewed the same way again. Unlike younger men who may argue or complain about feeling used, senior men often respond differently. They become quieter. They observe more. And when they finally reach their conclusion, they don't make dramatic speeches or demand appreciation. They simply withdraw. To the people left behind, the decision feels sudden and confusing. But to the older man, it feels like clarity. He's no longer willing to invest his remaining years in relationships where his value depends entirely on what he can provide rather than who he truly is. Another powerful psychological reason senior men cut everyone off is that their tolerance for disrespect becomes almost non-existent. This is something many younger people fail to understand. When a man is in his 20s or 30s, he often tolerates being overlooked, talked down to, or taken for granted because he wants to preserve the relationship. He tells himself it's not worth arguing about. He believes people will eventually appreciate him if he keeps showing patience. But after decades of life experience, something changes. By the time many men reach their 60s, they've learned that disrespect rarely disappears on its own. If someone repeatedly dismisses you, ignores your boundaries, speaks to you without respect, or constantly makes you feel unimportant, chances are they'll continue doing it. Older men no longer see these moments as isolated incidents. They see them as patterns that reveal a person's true character. This is why many senior men stop giving endless second chances. They're not becoming harsher, they're becoming clearer. They understand that protecting their dignity is more important than preserving a relationship built on disrespect. Many people assume older men leave because they're lonely, angry, or emotionally wounded. In reality, many leave because they've reached a point where being alone feels far more peaceful than constantly feeling diminished. Psychologically, dignity becomes one of the highest priorities later in life. A younger man may endure disrespect because he fears losing someone. An older man has often learned that losing himself is far more painful than losing the relationship. Once a senior man believes his dignity is no longer being respected, he rarely argues about it. He simply creates distance. not out of revenge, but because he finally understands that peace and self-respect are worth protecting, even if it means walking away from people he once cared about deeply. Another psychological reason many senior men cut everyone off is that they become emotionally selective. This doesn't mean they stop caring about people. It means they become much more careful about who they allow into their lives. As men grow older, something interesting begins to happen. They no longer measure relationships by quantity. They measure them by quality. When they were younger, they often tolerated one-sided friendships, difficult family members, emotionally draining relationships, and people who constantly took more than they gave. They convinced themselves that keeping the peace was simply part of life. But after decades of experience, many older men reach a point where they no longer see the value in maintaining relationships that consistently leave them feeling exhausted. Psychology suggests that as people age, their emotional priorities naturally change. They become less interested in excitement and far more interested in stability. Senior men are no exception. They don't want constant conflict. They don't want emotional games. They don't want relationships that require endless explanations. They simply want honesty, respect, and peace. This is why some people mistake older men for being cold or antisocial. The reality is often very different. They haven't stopped caring about people. They've stopped investing in relationships that never truly cared about them. The people who remain in a senior man's life after 60 are usually those who bring calm instead of chaos, respect instead of criticism, and understanding instead of unnecessary conflict. Everyone else slowly fades into the background. For many senior men, this isn't loneliness, it's discernment. They finally understand that one genuine relationship is worth far more than 100 superficial ones. And once they discover the peace that comes from being emotionally selective, very few are willing to go back to the way they lived before. The final psychological reason senior men cut everyone off is perhaps the most misunderstood of them all. Many people believe older men withdraw because they've stopped caring about others. In reality, for many of them, the opposite is true. They finally begin caring about themselves. For most of their lives, they placed everyone else first. They sacrificed their time for their families, their energy for their careers, their peace for their relationships, and their own emotional well-being to keep everyone around them comfortable. Saying yes became a habit. Carrying other people's burdens became their identity. They convinced themselves that this was simply what a good man was supposed to do. But after 60, many men begin asking a question they've avoided their entire lives. Who has been taking care of me? That question changes everything. They begin realizing that many of the boundaries they desperately needed should have been established decades earlier. They recognize the emotional cost of constantly pleasing people who rarely appreciated their sacrifices. They understand that protecting their peace isn't selfish. It's necessary. This is why so many senior men quietly walk away. They aren't trying to punish anyone. They aren't seeking revenge. They simply refuse to continue living a life where everyone else's comfort comes before their own. The biggest misunderstanding is believing these men no longer want relationships. Most still do. What they no longer want are relationships built on obligation, guilt, manipulation, or one-sided sacrifice. They have reached a stage of life where peace, dignity, and mutual respect matter more than popularity or approval. Perhaps the greatest psychological truth is this. Senior men rarely cut everyone off because they hate people. They cut people off because after decades of putting themselves last, they finally decide they deserve the same respect, peace, and emotional protection they spent a lifetime giving to everyone else. What we've uncovered today isn't just the psychology behind why some senior men cut everyone off after the age of 60. It's the psychology behind what happens when a man spends an entire lifetime learning which relationships bring him peace and which ones quietly take it away. If you noticed, none of these decisions happen overnight. An older man rarely wakes up one morning and suddenly decides to disappear. In most cases, that decision has been building for years through repeated disappointment, emotional exhaustion, broken trust, and the gradual realization that protecting his peace is no longer optional. The biggest mistake people make is assuming that when a senior man becomes distant, he has become bitter or no longer cares. More often than not, he has simply reached a stage where he refuses to sacrifice his emotional well-being just to keep everyone else comfortable. He has learned that peace is expensive, and he is no longer willing to pay for relationships that constantly drain it. That doesn't mean every man should isolate himself. Healthy solitude and unhealthy isolation are not the same thing. The strongest senior men aren't those who cut everyone off. They're the ones who learn to recognize the difference between people who bring peace into their lives and people who constantly bring conflict. They remove the chaos, but they remain open to sincerity, loyalty, and genuine companionship. So, I want to leave you with this question. If you reach the age of 60 tomorrow, would the people around you bring you peace or pressure? Think about that carefully, and let me know your answer in the comments below. If this video gave you a new perspective, don't forget to like it, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to understand why so many senior men quietly choose peace over pleasing everyone else. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.